Thank you, Jan, for that very, very warm acknowledgement. And can I, in turn, make two acknowledgements as well? Firstly, of course, I acknowledge that the land I stand on today always was and it's always going to be Aboriginal country. I respectfully acknowledge the elders of the Kulin Nation, past and present, and any of their descendants who might join us today. In acknowledging country, can I pause a moment to tell you an Aboriginal story, an Islander story, one of the many forgotten family stories of the Great War. This particular story is one the team at Monash has been working on for quite a time now, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge two remarkable young postgraduate students, Laura James and Beck Wheatley, for all the painstaking research that informs the 100 Stories project. The story that we want to tell you today comes from Cape Breton Island in Bass Strait, just across the water, In the course of the Great War, well over half of the eligible men enlisted. Their names, 21 names in all, are recorded on the island's war memorial. It's a simple bronze plaque set on a pillar of stone. The records don't actually tell us why Private James Menard here went to war. Perhaps as with many Indigenous servicemen, it was a quest to secure full citizenship. Perhaps, like many white diggers, the hope of travel and adventure, even romance. More than likely, it was just a chance of earning a decent wage. James Menard was wounded twice in action, 1917, that's Passchendaele, 1918, the attack on the Hindenburg Line. He came back to Australia a deeply damaged man. Unlike his cousins, William and Frank never came back to Cape Breton Island. Frank was killed in 1916. He's buried at Possie. I've just come back from there. William went missing during the Battle of Bullecourt, and he is missing still. The body of that boy, and he was a boy, was never recovered from the killing fields. So from the end of the war, right through the 1920s, their mother writes time and again to the military authorities, hoping to learn something of William's fate, longing for a photograph of his final resting place, craving just something to remember him by. This letter, written in that unsteady hand in 1918, a year since her son went missing. 2 pocketbooks, a penny, a halfpenny, 2 discs with a name on a cross, 1 little painted flower, 5 postcards. That's all I've got of my poor old Will. Eva Maynard's letter reminds us, doesn't it, of the pain, the grief, the unspeakable loss that the Great War visited on a whole generation. But of course, war wasn't the only way that Aboriginal people, that Islander people, lost their children. In the 1930s, this small, devastated community was devastated once again as white authorities relocated children, including the children of returned servicemen, to white families and white institutions on the mainland. Cape Breton Island was a community laid to waste in the aftermath of war. Lest we forget that. We acknowledge Aboriginal people, and may I equally warmly acknowledge all of you. I am delighted, indeed honoured, to join you for the family feast and also to support you in some small way in the wonderful work that you do. I know that many of you are involved in digitisation projects that are making family history records available to researchers across the globe. I know that many of you are experienced genealogists and that you've traced the complex relationships that have shaped families over centuries, over time. And I know that all of you, each and every one without an exception, is a great advocate of history. So, acknowledging you, can I thank you for all the work that you've done? And I thought actually I should give you something back in return. I bought 4 copies of my most recent book along with me today, and I'm going to give them away. It's a kind of door prize, if you like. One, of course, goes to Jan for her lovely introduction. But I've decided to give right on that corner, second row, right on that corner, second row, right on that corner, third row, a gift as well. Oh, and it is, in fact, a copy of On Dangerous Ground. And a word or two, if I may, about the book. Oh, and I believe there's going to be more prizes later today. So if you've missed out, don't feel bad about it. You've got a second chance. Just a word or two about the book, because I guess every family historian has got a favourite project, and in a way I think this has to be mine. Because at its heart, this is a family history. It's a story about George Irwin and his parents, who, like the Menard story I began with, experienced the terrible loss of war. Now, history, and that's my real job, can't tell you very much about Mrs. Irwin there. I can tell you that she started writing to the Red Cross Wounded and Missing Files in 1916, the Bureau. What does she say? "My son," she says, "may not be dead. No one saw him killed. He may have been wounded. He may have been taken prisoner. Many were. He may have lost his memory. He may come home." And she goes on writing like that and praying like that until 1921, when the last soldiers are repatriated. And looking at this picture, taken at Katoomba just a few days before George sailed away to war, you can sense a kind of foreboding, can't you? You can almost see the loss of her son in those doom-laden eyes. And I know you were looking at similar photographs earlier today. I came across Mrs. Irwin's story when I was researching the family pilgrimages that followed the Great War. George and Sarah Irwin were some of the first Australians to make their way to Gallipoli, and those of you who've seen the film Water Diviner can imagine just how difficult that journey must have been. This picture was taken in the 1920s. It shows you an old man and an old woman bent by the memorial to the missing at Lone Pine. The Irwins lost George the day Australians charged the neck, almost 100 years ago to the day, and here they are taking a rubbing of all that's left of their son, his name. History can tell you that, like a generation of mothers and fathers, the Irwins never recovered from that loss. But really that's about all history can tell you. George himself is largely lost to the historical narrative. He's still missing. We'll never know what became of him, how or why he died, who loved him or whom he loved in return, what Gallipoli really meant to George. In that light, I'd like to suggest that there is a space sometimes for imagined history. It's the history that a truthful, verifiable history can't actually tell. I called this book On Dangerous Ground, and it's a very appropriate title, I think, because it moves across different ways of remembering. It's part fact, but it's part fiction, and it actually recaptures the lives of real individuals, soldiers like George Irwin, lost in the limbo we call Gallipoli, C.W. Bean, the historian sent back to the peninsula to find out what happened there, Zeki Bey, the Turkish major he befriends, and George Lambert, the artist whose beautiful watercolours illuminate this book. All these people existed, and their actual testimony is woven through the book. I've used the archives wherever I can. They move across an ambitious timeline. 1915, the first days of the landing. 1919, when Bean travels back to Gallipoli. 2015, when our country faces that difficult question, how should we remember our war dead? So I guess the book is really three stories woven into one, the past informing the future and the present, as I believe it does. And this book, finally, is a family history in another sense too. I dedicated On Dangerous Ground to my grandfather, who fought at Queen's Post in the April of 1915. Queen's Post, as many of you will know, was the most vulnerable and the most perilous part of the Anzac Line. Here, two armies came literally face to face. The enemy trenches were just a few metres away. All through the campaign, soldiers called Queen's the haunted house. Why? Because all over the peninsula you could hear the cries of the dying and the wounded up there on the ridges. My grandfather too knew the importance of family. In all the time he was at Queen's, he actually kept a diary. And in the midst of all the chaos and all the carnage erupting around him, he remembered to send a birthday greeting to his darling Glad, the woman he would one day marry. That diary now is in the Australian War Memorial, and it reminds me, as I'm sure it does you as family historians, of men's humanity in the butchering inhumanity of war. I realise that's a very lengthy and self-indulgent introduction, but it did have a purpose. Unlike George Irwin, unlike the Menard boys, my grandfather survived the war. He was repatriated home. In truth, I don't remember very much about him. I remember a tall man in a grey coat with an inexhaustible supply of sweets in his pocket all the time. And I remember his cough. Like many men who fought at Anzac, Private Thomas Charles Scates went on to fight in France, and he was gassed. And eventually that hacking cough came to kill him, decades and decades after the war. Had my grandfather served with the Australian forces, he would almost certainly have had a repatriation file. And here can I thank Stephen for reminding us what we as Australians so often forget. Gallipoli wasn't just about Australia and New Zealand, it was about Britain and France and India as well, all the nations that came embroiled in there. Well, where has that taken us? I hope today to do two things with today's talk. First of all, I'm going to focus on Project Albany, the digitisation of Australia's unique repatriation records and one of our country's most extensive historical archives. It's a treasure. A few words by way of background here. The digitisation of repatriation records was the first, and it was the unanimous recommendation of a panel of historians appointed to advise Australia's Anzac Centenary Board. And that was actually, by my memory, that was the only point that 12 historians locked in a room in Canberra could agree on. And I'm sure that will surprise no one. Now, to date, the Australian government has committed $3.4 million to this project. Sounds a lot, but it's a woefully inadequate sum. Given the scale of the task is huge. And it's such a small fraction of what is the budget now for the Anzac Centenary? The other day in this room I heard the figure of $500 million. That's extraordinary. Why so little in making these incredible resources available to so many? Now, to date, very few people have actually viewed any of these records, and the samples that have been taken by historians have been very small, for obvious reasons. So I'm going to begin by walking you through a few of these files, and I'm going to try and explain why their digitisation should be so urgent a priority for the centenary. Repatriation files, of course, deal with the post-war story, a story that's too long been marginalised in the way that we remember 1914 to 1918, or should I say 1919 when the war actually ends, or should I say 1921 when the first AIF's disbanded, or should I say the 1960s when my grandfather dies. I'm going to go through these files and I'm going to argue that they are by their nature disruptive to that simplistic and overly romantic view of war we often see every Anzac Day. And then I'm going to introduce you to some of the ways that Australian historians and historians from all over the world might use these and other remarkable archives. In the second part of this paper, I'm going to examine the controversy centred around the 100 Stories project, which caused something of a rift within the Anzac Centenary Board in Canberra. You see, in the course of recovering these stories of Australia's post-war trauma, historians were told that many of these narratives were too confronting, too uncomfortable, and that really isn't in keeping with the mood the centenary should be trying to create. I actually want to seek your opinion on that today as fellow historians. I want to show you a few of these stories, and I want to ask you if you think we've dealt with them searchingly, sympathetically, indeed, if you think it's time now, 100 years on, for these stories to be told. So you get to vote at the end of this. That's good, isn't it? Let's turn to my first task then, a brief overview of the repatriation records. Now, you'll find a lot of images like these on the website of the National Archives of Australia. The site's recently been rebadged. It's called Discovering Our Anzacs, and that in itself is testimony to the way that thousands of Australians have connected to the past through the keyboard. They visit this site to view the service dossier of a man or woman who went to war and thus insert their family story within a wider national narrative. And I know Grace talked about that earlier, and all praise to the work that Grace and her colleagues have done in creating this magnificent resource for people all over the world. The site also provides a space for visitors to upload pictures and, of course, record family memories. Of course, 2 or 3 generations on, these are maybe not really memories at all. Post-memories is what historians would probably prefer to call them. In some ways, the site's become a virtual memorial, a place to pay tribute. But for the historian, these images highlight the selective nature of war remembrance. Invariably, the portraits the site hosts are handsome, they're heroic, like this one. They remind us of what the French historian Annette Becker has called the sterilization of war and violence. Like the memorials raised across the landscapes of Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, those noble structures of bronze and stone, these clean, whole and wholesome bodies disguise, don't they, the sordid reality of bodies that have been damaged, dismembered, altogether obliterated by war. So, the image I really want to begin with isn't that familiar image of a young, confident soldier, proud and handsome in his uniform, but an image of one of those men when he comes back from war, scarred by the experience of battle, aged prematurely by the terrible things he has seen and he has done, and struggling to adjust to a new life as a civilian. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Bertram Burns. Private Burns, the service record tells us, enlisted at the age of 24. He served in France. He was wounded in action on 2 separate occasions. The second wound did that. September 1918, Mont-Saint-Quentin. A splendid victory, many a military historian tells me, and a magnificent triumph for my personal sponsor today, General John Monash. I wonder if Bertram Burns thought so. Private Burns' service dossier runs for what? It's just 22 pages. There's actually only one letter from him, one chance for him to speak. It's this letter, written in 1938, asking to purchase duplicates of service medals that were lost in a bushfire. Why? He wants to wear them on Anzac Day. Now, reading the service dossier tells us very little about Private Burns, or his family, or his wound, or what it actually did to any of them. The repatriation files are so much more substantial. 3 separate files, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and they tell us so much more. What does that sparse entry in the service record, GSW, face, really mean? The medical record in the repatriation files refers to much facial disfigurement. I think Private Burns puts it much better than that. My face is practically shot away. The wound was so severe that he dribbled constantly, and there was a discharge from his nose. Bertram Burns had to live on what they called slop food. His disfigurement, which was much, much worse before that operation, was such that employers wouldn't take him on. He was shunned, he was ostracised, he took up a block of land as a soldier settler. He found himself too weak to work it. Now, reading the service record, you would learn nothing of that, nothing of his or his family's post-war ordeal. The repatriation records, on the other hand, tell us, and they tell us so much more. They help us to imagine what those of us who've never been to war can't possibly understand. And the visceral quality of their testimony doesn't lend itself to a romanticisation or a sanitisation of war. Why? Because you read these men's words, in their own words, and you can begin to imagine what it must have been like to spend days and nights in that continuous fever and delirium, a shaking and a shivering, as the file puts it. You can hear the hushed voices of what they used to call the whispering men, men whose lungs were slowly corroding, who could barely breathe, who vomited up their meals, who fell over with giddiness, and who, like this man, eventually lost confidence in himself. You can see the physical and the psychological scars of what we called back then a war-wrecked generation. And you can see how their injuries also destroyed the lives of those around them, not just for the duration of the service record, but for every day of their all too often short lives. Leroy, that gas man in the previous slide, turns to drink, and he turns on his wife as well. Now, you might think that's an unmitigated tragedy, an endless catalogue of horrors, but history, we all know, is never just that, is it? I say there is a great dignity in Bertram Burns. Look at how this man dressed on the day they took that photograph. Remember about the efforts he makes to provide for his family. And remember that this is a man, a veteran, who wants to wear his medals on Anzac Day. His battles don't end, though, in 1918. 2 things to notice about this slide, and no prizes for guessing. Look at that phrase, sentenced to destruction. When the repatriation records came to National Archives from the Department of Veterans Affairs, archives had to decide what to do with them. And frankly, they posed a huge problem. Huge, very literally. 10 kilometres of shelving space, a veritable forest of files. And as is so often the case with bureaucracies, people clutch for the simplest solution. I mean, who'd want to read the medical charts of long dead men? And maybe there were awkward issues of privacy too. And so for several months, the fate of these files was hanging in the balance. And can I pay tribute to the historians and the archivists back then, and back then wasn't so long ago, it's just 2004, who saved these remarkable files from destruction. Can I say this loudly and clearly? I think in all my experience as a historian, I've never seen richer archives than these, and I'm so pleased we're digitising them for the whole world for the Centenary. At least we're beginning that process. The second thing to notice about that file is the name. Thomas Abdullah's name is telling you something you don't often hear about the first AIF, do you? It's reminding us of its social and its cultural diversity. I think that's a story that we need to recover today if we're going to say something new about the Great War. Now, Thomas Abdullah's name stands out, but in most cases, the ethnic and the cultural diversity of the first AIF is concealed by the service record. Recruits are described as British subjects, aren't they? And often there's no clue as to Indian or Chinese or Indigenous descent. Because the repatriation records are fuller accounts, because they're embedded in community, because they're a record of families as much as they are of veterans, they offer you these kind of insights. I mentioned before the visceral quality of their testimony, but how do these files facilitate new historical understandings? What makes them so important today? Well, firstly, I think there's the potential for intergenerational health studies. Few countries in the world possess so comprehensive a health record for so huge a cross-section of the population. And I'm not just talking about veterans here. When former servicemen and women lodged a pension claim, they had to answer detailed questions, not just about their own health, but also the health of their families. The department had to determine if a condition was war-related or if it was congenital. Now, current work by my colleague Janet McKelman has demonstrated the potential of these intergenerational health studies. You probably know Janet's work on Convict Australia, and she's moving it on now to look at the First World War. By digitising these records, we're not just going to be making Janet's work easier, we are going to be showcasing one of our richest archives to a global digital community, and we'll be making history more accessible to local communities, to families like you. Second point. The repatriation files aren't just about the health of a nation. They're actually an insight into the society of their day. They tell us much about a much neglected phase in Australian history, the role of the state in the interwar period, the intervention of the medical expert into the life of the individual citizen, the workings of public welfare and private charity. They demonstrate, as Marina Larson and Al Thompson's work has shown, how war reaches into and how it damages the social fabric, how it touches us all. And for a Labor historian like myself, they reveal a great deal about a generation who I think was prepared to sacrifice so much, and yet really, when you think about it, was given so little in return. Promised a land fit for heroes, but often sent to work marginal land. Men and women unable to find remunerative employment, often as a direct result of their injuries. I used to cough and spit so much they always found some excuse to discharge me, who became reliant on inadequate pensions, who were forced into the position of supplicants. Men like Harry here, who even had to bludge a smoke from a mate. Imagine the indignity of that, bludging a smoke from another wounded mate. And these records span a vast political and I think emotional range as well. In an article which Melanie Oppenheimer have just published in Labor History, we explore the moral economy, as we call it, of Australia's soldier settlers. Their assertion of their rights, their outraged sense of entitlement, their sense of entitlement both as veterans but also as citizens. I won't go into the study in any great length, but I will just mention the case of a man who, like many soldier settlers, was burdened by huge debt from just about the very minute he set foot on the block. The government did a tally of exactly how much this man owed the state, and they sent him a bill, as they so often did, for several £100s. Now, this particular soldier settler, John Carter was his name, itemised not just every day he worked on the farm, but also the cost of going to the Great War, the cost of lost earnings, the cost of his injuries, and so on, and he presented the government with a bill of his own. And he stated quite plainly, quite clearly, that every man has a right to a living wage, and a returned man has a right to what you promised us, a land fit for heroes. It's a brilliant piece. And you get one letter after another in these Land Department's files, these men speaking back to the authorities, and you get exactly the same in the Repatriation Files as well, because they have to argue, for God's sake, I have lost my leg, what is that worth? And of course, many of those conditions, many of those war-related conditions, I mean, is that man coughing because he smoked all his life or because he was gassed? And so the pension authority makes a decision about that, and if the decision doesn't go the veteran's way, the veteran often fights against it. And they often draw into their support, of course, their family, their community, their RSL, and so on. Why should I mention all this? It actually gives you a great opportunity as family historians. What have you got now? You've heard about it today. You've got service dossiers, you've got Lands Department files, you've got repatriation records. You can triangulate all these sources and you can get a fuller and more nuanced understanding of what that generation went through and what it continued to go through in the post-war period. One final point. We've looked at how these men survived the war. The repatriation records show us how they struggled to survive the peace. And that, I hasten to add, isn't just a man's story. As this remarkable letter from the widow of Don Carney suggests, she tells us what it's like to live on the poverty line, to plead just a little bit of help at Christmas time. And she offers us an insight into what we call, as labour historians, the intermediate economy of a veteran's family. Women's voices like this one are threaded all through the repatriation files, and it's on a women's voice that I want to end this part of the paper today. This is a letter from Louisa Campbell. She's writing to the Repatriation Department not long after the death of her husband. Lieutenant A.B. Campbell came back from the war with severe respiratory problems, and she writes with an intimacy that I find quite disarming. My husband's death was the death to all my happiness, she says. He was no whiner. He hid his sufferings with a smile. Now, the circumstances of Lieutenant Campbell's death are by no means clear, but it was a violent death, as violent a death as you'll ever encounter in a war. Lieutenant Campbell's body was cut in two when he fell from a railway carriage in Sydney. Now, he may have opened that door because he was desperate for air, with both his lungs collapsing. Every breath was an effort. Or, as the coroner's report actually implies here, he may have chosen a quicker death to the one that was in store. What's beyond dispute is that Louisa Campbell believed that his death was directly attributable to his war service. He gave his life for his country, she writes, as surely as if he had died in battle. We did our bit. The department thought otherwise. Campbell's death was deemed not war-related. Her pension was assessed accordingly. Well, how can you access repatriation records? This astonishing new resource for family historians. There are actually step-by-step instructions in a new MOOC that's been offered by Monash University. I didn't know what a MOOC was 8 months ago. I was a happier man then. MOOC is an acronym for Mass Open Online Courseware. It's a university course at the stroke of a keyboard. And there's something great about the MOOC. It's free. I went to university at the very moment when fees were abolished in this country, and I wouldn't have got to university if it wasn't for that move. We're now, of course, reintroducing fees in all sorts of ways. This runs counter to that. It's the principle of free education, open to all, so please take advantage of it. The MOOC is based on the 100 Stories project, digital biographical stories available free online, and soon as you'll see, to be released as a book by Penguin. And again, on the back of this flyer that's in your lovely white show bag, there's an invitation to the launch at the Melbourne Museum. Please do come, it'd be lovely to see you there. Now, the MOOC includes not just the stories themselves, but debate and discussion by historians, leading historians, Jay Winter, Mike Roper, Alistair Thompson, Ray Francis. It's also got virtual tours of the battlefields. But most important of all for you, it's got guidance on how you can access archival records like the repatriation records we've been discussing today. But in accessing these records, can I suggest that you exercise a degree of caution? Why? Well, like any new archive, they challenge you to rethink the way you might view that war. And can I just give you one example from my own experience? Bernie Haynes here was 14 when he enlisted. He was 15 when he sailed off to war. He was 16 when his spine was shattered at Bapaume. They operated on that poor boy's body 48 times, and he dies of his wounds 8 years after the fightings actually ended. Now, when I first read Bernie's story, I was researching the history of the shrine, there was a consoling side to this terrible and tragic story. The press was adamant that he died a hero, smiling bravely as they wheeled him into the operating room. And the impression that you're given by this clipping here is that he dies actually as a soldier should. When I first read this sanitised description of his death from the Herald, I imagine a piece of shrapnel working its way through his body, severing some vital organ and striking that young boy dead. Of course, the repatriation records tell you a different story. They tell you the truth. Many of these operations were delivered under local anaesthetic. The boy could see the surgeons cutting away at him. And what actually happened is that Bernie died in his own excrement. So much of his colon had been removed that his body could no longer process the waste. It welled up inside his body to poison him. Now, there's no doubt that his family, his loving family, continued to care for him. And we have touching pictures of a sister offering what comfort she could. But the repatriation records, they leave us with a more disquieting memory of a boy who's frightened to die, who's disruptive to other patients, who's isolated in a dismal world, suffering in untold agony, who is alone. There's an irony in the case of Bernie Haynes, isn't there? This boy soldier died after 1921, so he isn't listed on the official tally of our nation's war dead. Bernie's name, unlike George Irwin's, doesn't gleam in gold in the cloisters of the Australian War Memorial. Perverse as it may seem, if Bernie had have suffered less rather than more, we would actually better remember him. And there's a second question here, isn't there? How should Bernie be remembered? The romantic heroic death offered readers of the Melbourne Herald, or the cruel clinical truth of the Repatriation File? To my mind, and you may not agree with me, I think we do his whole generation a great disservice when we diminish in any way the pain or the horror or the sordid suffering of that war. And that brings me to the final bit of today's paper. The 100 Stories project relies very heavily on these repatriation files. It was designed to broaden the ambit of remembrance, to reveal a history outside the authorised discourse we hear so often from Canberra, to face the uncomfortable truths that we've just confronted now. The stories emerged as a response to what I've called showbiz commemoration. In its first few meetings, the Anzac Centenary Board, and I chaired the panel of historians advising the board, was captivated by the suggestion that the names of Australia's war dead might be projected in lights across our war memorial over the whole course of the centenary. And maybe we could project them on the sails of the Opera House as well. And some went even further than that. I mean, why stop at our war dead? Well, we'd better include the New Zealand casualties. There's an NZ in Anzac, isn't there? I know this could be a global partnership, a continuous screening over 5 years of every casualty of the war. Have we got time to fit them all in? I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but if you've read the submissions that came into the Anzac Centenary Board, you'd know the kind of madness that was going on in Canberra. The war dead, all the war dead, can never be named. We can never know the names of the legions of Ottoman soldiers who were slaughtered at Anzac. There were no surnames in the Ottoman Empire. Who bothered to record the names of African soldiers fighting for one or other colonial empires? As Siegfried Sassoon once remarked, the appalling thing about the Great War is its sweeping anonymity, so many nameless names. And then there's the matter of naming itself, isn't there? It was so important in the 1920s to restore those individuals to the family who had lost and who loved them. But today, can naming still serve that same purpose? Or are those names, in a way, no longer truly ours? It's a big question, and I'll leave you with that one. Finally, and most importantly for me, just who qualifies as our war dead? Australia's official honour roll, as I said, those names gleaming in bronze at the heart of our National War Memorial, numbers 60,000 for World War I. But what of boys like Bernie, who died decades after the guns had stopped firing? Were they shattered Anzacs, not casualties as well? So, the 100 stories were a corrective to all this. They offered a fragment of Australia's experience of war, 100 lives to symbolise the 100 years of the Centenary. The stories were chosen from all across the country. They highlight the experience of men and women. They consider the way that war affected a generation. Amongst the cast of the 100 stories, not just soldiers, sailors, airmen, nurses, but parents who lost their sons, wives who struggled with those shell-shocked husbands, children who never actually knew their fathers. The cost of war is not confined to those who fight us. It touches us all. And that, of course, is where the Repatriation Files come in. Now, I'm going to trial just a couple of these stories today. They're very, very short. The first fell just within the comfort zone of the Anzac Centenary Board, and Canberra was keen to commission them. The second two I'm going to show you, though, mark a point of departure. Historians were asked, and I quote here, why there was a need to be so brutally honest. Well, that's an interesting question, and it begs another question, doesn't it? Do you really want a dishonest history of the Great War? And we were told that these stories were too challenging, too confronting. One story, as you'll see in particular. Stories like that had to be removed and replaced by what one board member called positive nation-building stories. And I hasten to add here that many members of the board actually supported the 100 Stories project, and I thank them earnestly today, as I thank my colleagues on the board who supported the digitisation of Repatriation Files. Okay, if the technology works, and I don't believe it will, we're going to play 3 of these stories in succession, and first of all, a word of explanation. These are silent presentations. Their purpose is to distill the archives. They rely on the written word. And silence is actually a deliberate play on the commemorative space of remembrance. It's a way of inviting the viewer to consider what we forget when we actually remember war. And here we go. Well, Frank Wilkinson was what they called a war hero, but he was also a shattered Anzac, to use Marina's phrase. I think today we classify Wilkinson as suffering from post-traumatic stress, and perhaps we wouldn't hasten to judge him. But this is the story that the Anzac Centenary Board refused to endorse. This is the story that went too far. Indeed, one senior bureaucrat told me that what the public hopes for from this centenary is, and I quote here, a warm, fuzzy feeling, not stories like the ones you've just seen. Well, actually, you're the Australian public, aren't you? And I wonder what feedback we should offer Canberra today. If you think 100 years on it's right to tell Frank Wilkinson's story, if you think we should face the uncomfortable truth about that war, if you think that history is something other than a warm, fuzzy feeling, will you join me and raise your right hand? Good on you. Thank you very much. We'll leave it there. Thank you.